We are on week 2 of our character studies in the Old Testament. And today we look at a character that I think gets oversimplified sometimes. You've ever heard the saying, the patience of Job. The more I read the book of Job, the more I think that is the people who say that actually kind of skipped the middle bit. um, but Job's story unpacks a really important pair of questions. One of which is very popular and is usually phrased, why do bad things happen to good people? The other is, can God be trusted to run his own universe? Because when there is suffering, we naturally wonder, what is God's relationship to it? And as every human character in this story speaks, you get to see different perspectives on that question. But I have to say that the midsection, the bulk of this book, reminds me of Proverbs 10, verse 19, which says, when words are many, transgression is not lacking. Because you start with Job, and he is depicted outright as a man who was blameless and upright, who feared God and turned away from evil. That is his description right out of the gate. But he was also described as very prosperous. He had 10 children, 7 sons, 3 daughters. He had multitudes of livestock and very many servants. He was described as the greatest of all the people of the East. And so one would say he's a good person who's been blessed by God. I'm going to read this story, and I'm going to skip a really crucial part. The part that Job had no way of knowing. Job's sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them. He would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another who said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. And while this one was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they're dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. If you were to hear a story like that, crucial part missing. You would say, well, I mean, if you believed that there was nothing but the universe that we see around us, you would say, well, that was a senseless series of coincidences that just ruined this man for no reason. If you believed in God, you might say, there's something wrong here. How could this have happened? And of course, Job had no way of knowing what lay behind all of this. And yet, his response to losing all of his prosperity in one day, in a sequence of relentless strokes, was mourning, but it was also worship, in which he gives God what is his due, that everything he had came from God, and God had the right to take it away. What he didn't know, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the adversary also came among them. And the Lord said to the adversary, from where have you come? And he answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it. And the Lord said to the adversary, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? The adversary said to the Lord, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all he has, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to the adversary, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. This would be a reason no one would have guessed. That Job was on display in the heavenly realms. That God was showing his confidence in Job's faith by allowing our great enemy to strike him so severely. You would have no way to know this. In fact, when you get to the end of the book, this is never explained to him. But it happens twice. Because the accusation against Job is not just that God has so sheltered him that he never had reason to doubt God's goodness, but that, we should say, no one could withstand physical infirmity without cursing God. The words he says are exactly skin for skin. All that a man has, he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he'll curse you to your face. So that's the second proposition. That the knife hasn't cut deep enough, in other words. And the Lord gives him consent. The only thing he's forbidden to touch is Job's life itself. He is to remain alive. And so we see in chapter 2, verse 7, the adversary went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. So that the only relief he can find is to take a shard of broken pottery to scrape himself with. It's like the man is in utter misery. Not only has everything that sustained his daily life, the children he loved, been taken from him. Now he has some sort of loathsome disease. And now we begin to hear human counsel addressed to Job in his misery. Job's companions, there are actually 5 of them. 3 occupy the bulk of the book, but the first one is his wife. She has what you might say in theatrical terms, basically one line. But one commentator I found quite enjoyed what he said. He says she had the role of playing Satan's role on earth by urging Job to curse God and die. It may be that she was so moved by his misery and the fact that there was no sign it would ever end, that he would ever be restored, that he would survive this disease that suddenly struck him, that she couldn't bear to see him suffering anymore, and she just blurts out, "You still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But Job's response to her is one of endurance. This is where you see the patience of Job. You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? And we get the statement, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. But you notice, to this point, his responses have been brief, to the point, and God focused. Then come the 3 friends. You can put friends in quotation marks if you like, because honestly, their intentions started out good. This is when they'd heard all of this evil that had come upon him. They each came from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite, and they made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they didn't recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. If they had only stopped there, they would have done well. But Job, in the overflow of his misery, doesn't curse God, but he curses the day he was born. Essentially, he starts out the whole conversation that is to follow, which we're just going to skip over, kind of like a rock skipping across a lake, because you've seen it. It's quite substantial. This is epic poetry. But he starts out by saying, "Why was I born if I was only going to come to this? I would have been better off never being born." And it's interesting that he uses the phrase, "Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in?" That was the accusation that the adversary had made, that God had so hedged him in with good that Job had never been tempted to doubt the goodness of God. And here, Job is talking about he's being hedged in by the dark and painful mystery of his suffering. And all of chapter 3 really is just this emotional outburst that the pressure has built up, and he cannot understand. And how do his friends respond? well, you have the eldest, Eliphaz the Temanite, whose opening line is, if one ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? Yet who can keep from speaking? It's when impatience is just pouring out, right? Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar are the representatives in this epic poetry of conventional human logic. That God acts directly according to our own behavior. That he makes the rich prosper because they're righteous, and he makes the wicked suffer because they're wicked. And so the logic goes, if Job has ceased to prosper, then it must be because of an unconfessed sin hidden in his life. And Job's response is always, but I know of no such thing. We had his opening. I mean, he was so meticulous in his fear of the Lord that he made offerings on behalf of his children just in case one of them, in a moment of merrymaking, might have cursed God. This is how careful the man was in his worship of God. And to have these men saying, well, no, obviously your situation points out that you must be hiding something. And it gets increasingly rude as they go along, accusing him of who knows what. That Job begins to, I mean, this is where we cease to talk about the patience of Job, and we could definitely talk about the sarcasm of Job, the anger of Job, the impatience of Job. In fact, he even begins to justify his impatience because no answer is given him as to why his life has suddenly become a wreck, a complete and utter, one might say, unredeemable wreckage. And meanwhile, his friends just, I mean, instead of showing sympathy for, he admits, rash words spoken in grief and pain, they take offense at the sharpness of his protests. I'll give you some examples. Like Eliphaz, my favorite example of his, is in chapter 15. If you look at verse 4, you are doing away with the fear of God and hindering meditation before God. For your iniquity teaches your mouth, and you choose the tongue of the crafty. Your own mouth condemns you, and not I. And he's like, wait a second. Pompous much? And Bildad, you look at chapter 18, verses 3 and 4. His response to Job's insistence that he has known he has lived his life with a clean conscience. He knows of no sin that would have led to anything like this. And Bildad says, why are we counted as cattle? Why are we stupid in your sight? You who tear yourself in your anger, shall the earth be forsaken for you, or the rock be moved out of its place? Like, they're just more concerned about their own dignity and being right than they are with comforting him in any meaningful sense. And Zophar, who, there's a cycle, there's a pattern to the arguments where all three of them speak and Job answers each one. And then all three of them speak. When you get to the second cycle, Zophar gets like 5 verses and Job just cuts him off and he doesn't get to speak anymore in the book. It's like, but there probably is if you hear from chapter 20, Zophar answered and said, therefore my thoughts answer me because of my haste within me. I hear censure that insults me. And out of my understanding, a spirit answers me. Like, all right, why are you even here? Job keeps saying, what have I done? If I could only speak before God, if I could only present my case to him, that he would speak to me and we would just discuss what happened and I could get an explanation. And to his friends, this is blasphemy because the explanation should be really obvious. Human wisdom says, and this is, this was universal in the ancient Near East, that catastrophe was a sign that you had displeased the gods in some way, and that there was some sort of propitiation you would have to make before your life would be back on track, before they would start to bless you again. And they're adopting this into Yahweh, that he would behave like this. And they insist all the way through that Job should yield and admit that this is true. And he goes on insisting that he knows it is not true because he knows what can be known of his life. And if he has sinned, he says, it's never been to this extent, according to your measure, that it merits losing everything, up to and including his health. And so you can see the frustration just keeps building, and it's pretty early on. The snark of Job emerges in chapter 12. No doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. Chapter 13. As for you, you whitewash with lies. Worthless physicians are you all. Oh, that you would keep silent. That would be your wisdom. And back and forth and back and forth. Until we meet another person. We don't know where he came from. He wasn't mentioned in the beginning. His name is Elihu, which is interesting in that it is the only Hebrew name of any of the characters in the book. Elihu, the son of Barachel. He comes in chapter 32. And he's a kind of a curious point. It's like he's only there in order to provide a pivot to the narrative, because he is so frustrated with all of his elders, Job and the three friends. It says he was burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God, which is what he had fallen into in all this argument, trying to defend himself to these three friends. He had lost sight of what he had said from the very beginning, that God gives, God takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Shall we accept good from God and not evil? He had fallen into this complete self-justification. But it says he burned with anger also at Job's three friends because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. He had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. When he saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, he burned with anger. And he gets to unbroken, uninterrupted. He had 6 chapters. Sorry, 5. In which he's an odd combination of the conventional human logic and, of course, youthful impatience, but also an attempt to redirect the conversation to God himself, rather than attacks on the defenses of Job's own integrity. And he does then act almost as if you talk about in theatrical terms, especially Greek theater, the chorus that directs attention to chapter 38. Where God speaks. The Lord answers Job out of the whirlwind. If you read this answer, chapters 38 through 41, expecting to find him explaining himself to Job, you will be disappointed, because he makes no defense of himself. Instead, he broadens the conversation. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Who stretched the line upon it? Or on what were its bases sunk? Who laid its cornerstone when all the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy? We've gone now from the overly simplistic conventional wisdom and from Job's slightly more sophisticated trust that if he could just speak to God and God would answer him, it could all be resolved, to the complexities of creation, the marvels, the mysteries. I would just love to sit here and read all of this to you. We don't have time for that. But he talks about the weather, the constellations, the wildlife. And if you get to chapter 40, there's a little interlude. Shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? He who argues with God, let him answer it. Because if you'd been through all the rest of the book, you would know that Job's insistence all along had been, if he had the chance to speak to God face to face, he would plead his case, justify himself before the Lord. But now the opportunity has come. And what is Job's response? Well, you get the feeling that his defense of his integrity is the last thing on his mind. In fact, he says, behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I've spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further. And the Lord challenges him again. Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? And that is a key question in this whole book. When we began, Job was right in saying, whatever has happened, I know that God is righteous. And I know that he is sovereign. But he had lost that along the way in the midst of arguing, trying to defend himself, so that he would even call God his adversary. But there was an adversary who had, by the way, been proved wrong, had been put thoroughly in the wrong by Job's initial response. And God, who was for Job, is now clarifying. He talks about majesty and dignity. He says, clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. It's like, So if you're so concerned about yourself, about defending your integrity, you do all this, which are, of course, qualities only God possesses, including, if you get to 40, verse 13, hide them all in the dust together, bind their faces in the world below, and then I will also acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you. When they finished this conversation, and God has pointed out all of the marvels, the mysteries, the glory that he himself possesses, that he sustains all things, is sovereign over all things. Job's answer in the end, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. And he quotes God, who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? His answer to that is, therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. He quotes God again, hear and I will speak, I will question you and you make it known to me. And Job answers, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. That's interesting. The Hebrew, you can see, if you have a good study Bible, it probably has a footnote that word repent could also be translated am comforted. All this time he has been looking for comfort, and his friends couldn't give it to him with the conventional wisdom of the world. Yet, though his initial questions have not been answered, why? Why did all of this have to happen? Did I do something wrong? As soon as his attention is turned from himself to God, there he finds his comfort. And he gets his justification, his vindication too. Because the Lord speaks to the three friends. My anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. That's not to say that all the way through the argument, what Job said about God was entirely right. Some of it was right. Some of it was definitely wrong. But now he has come to the point where he speaks what is right about God. And yet somehow these three friends, who are somewhere very close by, are not moved to similar professions. And so the Lord says, take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves, and my servant Job shall pray for you. Do you hear the reiteration? My servant Job. 3 times he says this, and says that if they want to be forgiven, it has to happen through Job's intercession for them. Now, if that doesn't tell a person that God is pleased with that person, I don't know what would. And the final phrase reiterates, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. And so the 3 do what the Lord tells them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. So the first thing that is restored for Job is reputation. Despite all that has happened, it is made very clear to the people near to him that none of it happened because the Lord was angry with or displeased with Job. But that is not the end of the restoration. The Lord restores the fortunes of Job after he had prayed for his friends. That's also an interesting note. And gave him twice as much as he had before. Now, if you go back to the beginning, that was a lot. This, twice that, is astonishing. And it began with all of his brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him before, who came to eat bread with him in his house, showed him sympathy, comforted him for all the evil the Lord had brought upon him, and gave him a piece of money and a ring of gold. He must have known a lot of people. But the blessings keep coming. His latter days, it says, were blessed more than the beginning. 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 female donkeys. Again, 7 sons and 3 daughters, which may have been his wife's punishment for what she said. And it says that his 3 daughters were the most beautiful. And their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers as equals. And after this, he lived a further 140 years and saw his sons, his grandsons, to the 4th generation, and died an old man and full of days. Now, that's not to say that all the pain was taken away along with the disgrace and the privation. But he lived a richer life, not just in the sense of his tangible wealth. So the character of Job it's a difficult book to read. I will say that because, I mean, poetry, for one thing, is quite a challenge if you're not used to it. But I would recommend, if you're going to tackle the book of Job as any kind of a study, or if you're hit that part during your reading through the Bible, that you also invest in a book called How to Read the Bible Book by Book. The authors are Gordon Fee, F-E-E, and Douglas Stewart. They give an overview of Job that is incredibly helpful to get you oriented toward what the book contains and how to keep on track. Because honestly, you get to the point where you're like, I can't even remember which one is talking anymore. But Job is one of the most remarkable books in that it's such a long book and focused on one topic only: the sovereignty of God in a broken and a fallen world. And how do we explain that? How do we reconcile what we know of what's happening in the world with what we know of God? And Job deals with that in a way that reveals the emptiness of the world's answers to such questions and redirects us to the glory of God. The next week, we've hit the part where I want to talk about the period of Abraham, and yet everybody always talks about Abraham himself. I'm going to look at the people around Abraham. The first week, we're going to look at Lot, and we're going to also have a glimpse at that mysterious character, Melchizedek.